Hello, my dear friends. If you think drugs, ecstasy, and marijuana are only in the 21st century, you might want to take a closer look at history. In the Middle Ages, people got high from church incense to mouldy bread, from anesthetic herbs to mildly poisoned holy water. No one named drunkenness, but everyone went through it. Whether it was a priest, a midwife, a dying person, or a newborn baby. The deeper you dig, the more you'll find that you're no stranger to that world. Tonight, you're going to slip quietly into the fog of medieval minds, where faith, survival, and intoxication were all just one breath apart. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone in medieval Europe reached the point where no treatment could cure their pain, the answer was not to fight against the illness, but to find a way to leave it behind for a little while. A farmer crushed under a falling cart, a woman who had given birth too many times, or an old man coughing blood in the winter would all eventually reach a stage where remedies no longer mattered. The doctors, who had so few real cures, turned instead to mixtures that dulled suffering. Wine, already common in daily life, became the base, and into it they added plants and resins that had strong effects on the body. Opium resin, brought in through trade, was one option. Mandrake root, long feared for its strange properties, was another. Henbane, with its bitter taste and dangerous strength, was also used. These substances did not save anyone. They allowed the patient to drift, to fall into a haze where the body was heavy but the mind seemed far away. Families saw this moment and called it mercy. The idea was not to heal, but to create a pause from agony. People who had seen their relatives screaming through the night would say that even 1 hour of quiet was a blessing. The drinks mixed by physicians were strong enough to pull a person out of their pain for a time, but they often carried risks that no one understood. Doses were measured by guesswork. A little too much could stop breathing. A little too little would not calm the body at all. Yet families accepted the danger. In a world without antibiotics, without surgery that could repair, and without real knowledge of infection, they could only look for silence. It is striking that the same mixtures appear again and again in medieval records. Mandrake was feared for its shrieking reputation when pulled from the ground, but in small amounts it was considered a gift to those near death. Henbane was poisonous to animals, yet in carefully chosen doses it was used as a sleeping draught. Opium resin, imported at a high price, was reserved for the sick who could not find rest in any other way. Each of these, when combined with alcohol, blurred the senses and created a sensation that many people came to seek, even when they were not at the edge of dying. What started as a tool for the desperate slowly became something desired in other situations, too. The church sometimes looked on these practices with suspicion, yet even priests had to admit that the relief could seem miraculous. When a man racked with fever suddenly lay still and breathed calmly, the family gave thanks to God as well as to the medicine. No one wanted to believe that it was simply the effect of narcotics. They chose to see it as divine mercy. The patients themselves, if they were still conscious, often welcomed the haze. After days or weeks of unbearable pain, the chance to float away from reality was enough to make them ask for more. It almost sounds comical that people feared demons in the shadows but trusted a bottle filled with poison to be their last comfort. The pattern of use was clear. At first, mixtures were given to those who had no chance of survival, but then they began to spread. People who were not dying, only suffering from broken bones or lingering sickness, started to request them. Physicians who realized that their other remedies rarely worked began to rely more heavily on these potions. Instead of herbs for digestion or salves for wounds, they reached for the strongest sedatives in their cupboards. By doing so, they changed the culture of healing from trying to cure to simply trying to numb. For the poor, access was more limited, but it was still there. Local healers knew plants that grew in the fields and forests. They knew which roots and leaves carried power, and they prepared crude versions of the same sedatives. A woman in a small village might grind henbane and mix it into ale for her husband, who lay coughing with a chest infection. A shepherd with a broken leg might chew on dried mandrake root while his family prayed over him. These were not carefully measured doses, but they worked well enough to send the sufferer into sleep, and for many, that was good enough. The wealthy had access to more refined mixtures. Apothecaries in towns and cities kept small jars of imported opium, often locked away until requested by a physician. These were added to wine or honey and presented in glass vials that looked elegant on the shelf. A noblewoman might keep one near her bed in case of sleepless nights. A knight recovering from wounds might be given a stronger preparation to keep him still. What united both rich and poor was the same belief that these substances were gifts of nature, not threats to life. Over time, the experience of drifting away became something more than just relief. It was remembered. Those who had once been on the edge of death but survived sometimes spoke of the strange calm that overcame them. They described how the world seemed distant, how voices sounded far away, and how their pain seemed to dissolve. These accounts spread, and soon others wished to feel the same, even if they were not suffering as badly. That is how a medicine meant for the dying began to shape the habits of the living. If we compare it to today, it would be like morphine being handed out freely at the local pharmacy for headaches and toothaches. The normalization of these mixtures is one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval medicine. People did not view them as dangerous. They were seen as part of the ordinary practice of care. A bottle of sedative might sit on the same shelf as a jar of dried lavender or a pot of honey. Families used them when the need arose and rarely questioned whether the need was truly medical. This acceptance meant that use expanded. Slowly, villages and towns learned to expect that suffering could be dulled, even if only briefly. Doctors themselves became accustomed to prescribing these substances. Some kept records of how many drops to use or how long the effect lasted, but there was no scientific method guiding them. What they relied on was experience, passed down from teacher to student. The result was uneven. One patient might find themselves gently soothed, while another might never wake again. And still the practice continued, because in most cases the relief was real, even if it was temporary. When looking at this part of history, it is easy to think that people were reckless, but in truth, they were desperate. They lived in a world of constant injury, infection, and untreatable disease. Their choices were not between safe and unsafe, but between suffering and silence. I cannot help but feel that if I lived then, I too would have taken the cup without asking what price it might demand later. The image of a medieval sick room tells the story clearly. A patient moaning in pain, a family gathered around, and a physician pouring a dark liquid into a wooden cup. The patient drinks, their body slackens, and for the first time in days, the room is quiet. The family looks at one another with relief. They do not think of addiction or danger. They only think of how precious this silence is. It is in that moment that we see how getting high in medieval times was not about pleasure, but about survival. What began as a way to ease the suffering of the dying soon spread further, and as it did, people discovered that altered states could serve purposes beyond medicine, leading them into strange new practices that touched religion, ritual, and even daily life. In medieval monasteries, silence was not only a practice but a way of life. Days were marked by bells, chants, and prayers that repeated until they became part of the body's rhythm. Within those stone walls, monks tried to strip themselves of worldly distractions so that they might draw closer to God. For some, ordinary devotion was not enough. They believed that to truly hear the divine, they had to push the body beyond its limits. They fasted for days, sometimes weeks, eating only scraps of bread or drinking thin broth. Their bodies grew weak, their eyes hollow and their minds restless. Hunger gnawed at their strength, and lack of food sharpened every sound and thought. What they called visions often began as the natural result of starvation. Sleep was another sacrifice. Monks woke in the middle of the night to chant, and some kept vigil for long hours without rest. When the body is denied sleep, it begins to play tricks. The lines between dream and reality blur. In the stillness of a cold chapel, with candles flickering and shadow shifting, a monk could easily believe he had seen an angel pass by, or heard a voice that did not belong to any brother. They recorded these experiences as holy encounters, but the descriptions show the clear marks of exhaustion. The brain, worn down by long deprivation, created images that felt more real than anything they had seen while awake. Incense added to this altered state. Monasteries burned large amounts of resin, frankincense, and myrrh. The smoke filled the air during prayers, seeping into lungs and clinging to stone walls. In a poorly ventilated room, after hours of chanting and fasting, the combination of hunger, lack of sleep, and thick air created an overwhelming effect. The monks described feelings of floating, of leaving their bodies, of hearing voices that guided them. It is almost amusing that what they thought was the whisper of God may have been nothing more than their bodies failing under pressure. Herbal substances also played a role. Some monasteries cultivated gardens with plants that had strong effects when burned or brewed. Sage, juniper, or henbane could be used in rituals, sometimes deliberately, sometimes without knowledge of their strength. When mixed with incense, they made the air heavy and the mind unsteady. A monk sitting in meditation for hours might begin to feel as if he were seeing the heavens open. To him, it was proof of divine favour. To us, it is clear that the chemistry of plants and the fragility of the human body were at work together. The writings that survive from these experiences often speak in great detail. A monk might describe a vision of Christ standing in light, or angels singing, or terrifying demons rising from the floor. Modern readers can recognize the signs of hallucination. The images were too vivid, too strange, and too sudden to be ordinary prayer. If we compare it to today, it would be like someone staying awake for 3 days straight, breathing heavy smoke in a closed room, and then insisting that the things they saw in the corner were revelations. Not every monk sought such extremes, but those who did often gained reputations for holiness. Their brothers believed they had special access to the divine. Pilgrims travelled to hear their words or touch the walls of the places where visions were said to appear. The visions became part of the power of the monastery, attracting donations and strengthening its influence. What no one admitted was that these holy encounters were as much about biology as they were about faith. The cycle was self-reinforcing. A monk who starved himself and claimed to see a vision was praised, not questioned. Others tried to follow, hoping for the same gift. The practices of fasting, vigils, and long meditation became traditions that passed through generations. Over time, they were accepted as normal ways to deepen prayer. Few realized that these customs had the side effect of creating states of delirium that were mistaken for divine voices. The physical toll was immense. Bodies weakened, bones grew fragile, and illnesses spread quickly among those who denied themselves food and rest. Yet the promise of hearing God made the suffering seem worthwhile. A monk might collapse after days of vigil, and his brothers would call it proof of devotion. They did not see that the human body can only endure so much before it begins to break. I find it hard not to think that if I lived then, I too might have mistaken dizziness and faint voices for something greater. Monastic life was built on discipline, but discipline pushed to extremes often led to states that looked like madness from the outside. The difference was in the interpretation. To the monks, the trembling, the cries, the strange visions were marks of divine touch. To us, they are clear evidence of what happens when the body is deprived and the mind is overworked. Yet without the language of science, they had only the language of faith. These experiences shaped medieval spirituality. Tales of visions spread beyond the cloister walls and into villages. People believed that holy men had direct access to God, and that their words could guide the living. The reputation of monasteries grew stronger with every story of a monk who saw the heavens open. Ordinary people, struggling with their pain, looked up to these figures as proof that the divine was close. In truth, the monks were as human as anyone, caught in the same search for relief from suffering, and often carried away by the simple chemistry of hunger, smoke, and exhaustion. The image of a candlelit chapel filled with smoke, where pale men knelt for hours until they swayed and fell into visions, captures the mixture of faith and biology that defined much of the medieval way of getting high. They did not use the word high, but they knew the feeling of leaving the world behind, if only for a little while. These visions were not the end of the story. As the practice of altered states spread, other groups outside the monastery discovered their own ways of reaching similar conditions, blending herbs and rituals that carried them even further from the ordinary world. In medieval villages, much of the knowledge of healing did not come from universities or scholars, but from women who lived close to the land. They were midwives, herbalists, and caretakers who knew the plants of the fields and forests better than most men of learning. When a child was born, when a wound needed cleaning, or when a sickness spread, these women were called. They had baskets of dried herbs, jars of oils, and recipes passed down from older generations. Among their tools were plants that carried powerful alkaloids. These were not mild remedies like chamomile or mint. They were belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and aconite. In small doses, they dulled pain and eased fear. In larger doses, they created visions and sensations that took people far from the ordinary world. The methods of using these plants were varied. Some were ground into powders and mixed with fat or oil to create ointments. These ointments were rubbed on the skin, where the compounds entered the body slowly. Others were brewed into strong concoctions, though drinking them was dangerous and sometimes deadly. Still others were burned so that the smoke could be inhaled. The result was the same, a drifting, floating feeling, where the body felt light and the mind slipped into strange images. Villagers whispered that these women could fly or commune with spirits. What they were truly doing was experimenting with the chemistry of plants. It is almost darkly humorous that what terrified inquisitors as witchcraft was often nothing more than the side effects of a strong herbal paste. These women did not use their knowledge for amusement. Their world left little room for play. Instead, they reached for these methods to cope with pressures that weighed heavily on them. Women in medieval society had few rights and little power. They were expected to marry, bear children, and remain under the authority of men. For those who lived on the edges of villages or who never married, the role of healer or midwife offered a kind of independence. But independence came with isolation and suspicion. In their solitude, these women often relied on their herbs not only to serve others, but also to find escape for themselves. The floating sensation, the brief journey outside ordinary awareness, was a way to loosen the bonds of a rigid world. The reputation of flight is one of the most enduring. Tales spread that witches rode through the night sky on broomsticks. In reality, ointments made from henbane or belladonna, when applied to sensitive areas of the skin, produced vivid hallucinations of flying. A woman who lay still after applying such a mixture might truly feel her body lifting and soaring. To her, it was a real journey. To her neighbours, who saw her speak of strange travels, it was proof of sorcery. The broomstick became a symbol not because of magic, but because the ointments were often applied with a staff or stick coated in the mixture. If we compare it to today, it would be like using a pharmaceutical hallucinogen and then insisting that the visions were literal experiences of travel. Records from trials and inquisitions describe these experiences in detail. Judges wrote down confessions in which women said they had flown, danced with spirits, or joined strange gatherings at night. What the court saw as evidence of witchcraft were in fact the reports of people under the influence of powerful plants. The women were punished not for magic but for their knowledge of chemistry that was centuries ahead of its time. Despite the risks, people still came to them for help. A woman in labour might be given a small dose of mandrake to dull the agony of childbirth. A man with a deep wound might be soothed with henbane smoke to calm his cries. The same substances that created visions were also the only painkillers available in many communities. The line between medicine and hallucination was thin, and these women walked it every day. Their role in society was complicated. They were needed and feared at the same time. Villagers respected their knowledge but whispered about their powers. Church authorities often condemned them, yet even priests sometimes looked the other way when their skill saved lives. The women themselves lived in the tension between serving their communities and protecting themselves from suspicion. To them, the herbs were tools. To others, they were signs of danger. Over time, the image of the witch was shaped by these practices. The ointments, the smoke, the trances, and the visions became stories of demonic pacts and midnight flights. The reality was more ordinary but no less remarkable. These women had discovered how to use the plants around them to alter the mind, to create moments of release from unbearable pain and pressure. I cannot help but feel that their search for escape was not so different from ours today, only with far fewer safeguards and far more risk. What stands out is that these women were not trying to rebel against society in open defiance. They were finding hidden ways to breathe within a system that allowed them little space. Their practices were not about indulgence. They were about survival, both physical and emotional. The sensation of floating, the dreamlike visions, the easing of pain were ways to endure lives that were otherwise harsh and narrow. The medieval world branded them witches, but in truth, they were early experimenters with altered states. Their knowledge of plants, though dangerous, gave them power over suffering. It also placed them in constant danger of persecution. The line between healer and witch was drawn not by what they did, but by who chose to judge them. The sight of a woman grinding herbs by candlelight, preparing an ointment that might ease childbirth or send her into a trance, is one of the clearest images of how medieval people got high. It was not entertainment, it was a small rebellion against pain and a brief escape from a rigid order. From the silence of the cloisters to the secret work of village healers, the pursuit of altered states was spreading, and soon it would step onto the battlefield, where warriors turned to drink and strange plants to face death without fear. On the fields where battles were fought in medieval Europe, the fear of death was heavy in the air. Men carried spears, swords, and axes, but they also carried dread. Facing an enemy in close combat meant knowing that every swing could be the last. To overcome this fear, some warriors turned to substances that altered their minds. Before the clash, they drank wine mixed with mandrake root, a plant known to cause visions and dull pain. Others consumed mushrooms that carried hallucinogenic properties. These preparations did not sharpen skills or improve strategy. What they did was push fear out of the mind and replace it with a reckless sense of invincibility. For the men who swallowed these mixtures, stepping onto the battlefield became easier because their sense of reality was already shifting. The effect was powerful but unpredictable. The mandrake drink numbed fear, but it also blurred judgment. The mushrooms heightened aggression, but they also distorted vision and balance. Warriors sometimes fought with wild energy, ignoring wounds that should have brought them down. They shouted, charged, and swung their weapons with terrifying force. But just as often, the same substances caused confusion. A man could just as easily strike a friend as a foe, or stumble into danger without realizing it. The gamble was accepted because fear was considered a worse enemy than confusion. If a man forgot his terror, even at the cost of reason, the army saw it as a kind of strength. It is almost funny that an army thought mushrooms could replace discipline, when in reality, they only made the battlefield look like a tavern brawl gone wrong. Folk tales from the period describe these warriors in glowing terms. They tell of men who fought without pain, who continued to swing their swords even with deep wounds, who seemed possessed by something beyond human. In some stories, these fighters were believed to be under the protection of spirits or gods. They were said to enter a state of frenzy that no ordinary man could withstand. To the people who told the tales, this was proof of divine favour. To us, it looks like the clear mark of altered states brought on by substances that dulled pain and sharpened frenzy. The rituals before battle often reinforced these effects. Drinking together was not only about sharing strength, but about making an oath. Blood was sometimes mixed with the drink, sealing a promise that no man would flee. Once the mixture of wine, mandrake, or mushrooms took hold, the warriors believed they had bound themselves to something greater than their fear. Their shouts grew louder, their movements more violent, their eyes unfocused. Villagers who later heard of these scenes passed them down as stories of men who felt no pain. In truth, the pain was still there, but their minds had been pushed so far from ordinary awareness that they could not respond to it. The connection between intoxication and violence was not unique to one region. Across Europe, different groups found similar ways to blunt fear before facing death. In the north, sagas speak of fighters who howled like beasts and tore through their enemies without hesitation. In central and southern lands, chronicles mention soldiers drinking strange brews before charging into battle. The common thread is clear substances that altered the mind were used to turn ordinary men into figures of terror, if only for a short time. This practice had consequences. Some battles descended into chaos because intoxicated fighters ignored orders. Commanders struggled to keep control when men lost all sense of discipline. Yet the memory of their ferocity lingered longer than the memory of their mistakes. Stories focused on their fearlessness, not on the confusion they caused. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like soldiers entering combat after taking hallucinogens, then being remembered as heroes for their wild courage rather than for the chaos that followed. For the men themselves, the experience was intense. They felt power coursing through them, as though nothing could touch them. Wounds that would normally drop them to the ground seemed distant, as if happening to someone else. The mix of chemicals in their bodies and the roar of battle around them created a storm inside the mind. In that storm, pain and fear were drowned out. The cost often came later, when the body collapsed from exhaustion, or when madness lingered long after the fighting was done. Communities that survived these warriors told stories for generations. Children grew up hearing about men who charged into battle without flinching, who fought until their last breath, who seemed to stand between human and spirit. These tales added to the myth of invincible fighters, but behind the myth was a simpler truth. They had consumed substances that changed their minds, and those changes made them act in ways that others could not explain. It is important to remember that not all soldiers followed these practices. Many fought sober, relying on courage and training. But the image of intoxicated warriors was powerful because it captured something people longed to believe, that fear could be defeated, whether through magic, gods, or plants. The dream of a fearless fighter inspired both awe and dread. I think if I had lived in those times, I would have been tempted to drink as well, not to gain strength, but just to make the fear smaller. The picture of warriors standing on the edge of battle, drinking bitter brews, swearing oaths, and then charging forward in frenzy shows how deeply substances had entered the culture of survival. It was not about joy or celebration. It was about facing death without breaking. As the stories of fighters spread, other parts of medieval life also carried practices that led to unexpected intoxication, especially during festivals where ordinary villagers joined together in drink, dance, and ritual fire that carried them into states of collective energy. Life in medieval villages was tied to the seasons. Planting, harvesting, and the long winter months shaped the rhythm of every year. When summer came and the fields were green, people gathered for festivals that broke the routine of labour. These celebrations were filled with music, dancing, and food. but they also carried something unexpected. Without realizing it, many villagers slipped into states that today we would recognize as mild intoxication. It was not planned, nor was it deliberate. It was a natural result of what they ate, what they drank, and the way they filled the night with noise and fire. Alcohol was always part of these events. Wine and ale were brewed at home, often with little control over fermentation. A jug might contain a mild drink one day, and a much stronger brew the next. People drank deeply, not counting cups or measuring strength. For many, the taste of sour wine or thick ale was the flavour of celebration itself. Alongside the alcohol came bread and other foods that had their own surprises. Rye, when infected with a fungus known as ergot, could carry compounds that caused visions and tremors. Villagers who ate bread from such grain sometimes felt dizzy or restless, without understanding why. They blamed spirits or demons, never guessing that it was the mold hidden in their food. The fires added another layer. Bonfires were central to many festivals, whether to mark midsummer, drive away evil, or celebrate the harvest. Large piles of wood, resin, and herbs were burned, filling the air with smoke that clung to clothes and skin. Inhaling this smoke for hours, while standing close and breathing heavily, changed how people felt. Combined with the alcohol and food, it created a haze that blurred the line between ordinary wakefulness and altered states. It is almost amusing that what villagers thought was holy smoke might have been nothing more than the fumes of resin, making them light-headed. Music carried the crowd further. Drums, pipes, and string instruments played the same patterns again and again, creating rhythms that drew people into a trance-like state. Dancing around the fire, stamping feet, clapping hands, and spinning in circles made the body dizzy. Hours of this, with little rest and constant excitement, pushed the senses beyond normal boundaries. By the middle of the night, people felt as though they were floating together in one wave of energy. To them, it was joy and community. To us, it looks like the effect of overstimulation mixed with intoxicants. Staying awake long into the night deepened the feeling. Most villagers usually rose with the sun and slept not long after dusk. Festivals broke this pattern. Fires burned until morning, songs echoed through the dark, and children ran about without being called to bed. Fatigue added its influence. Eyes blurred, thoughts slowed, and perception grew hazy. When mixed with alcohol, smoke, and music, fatigue created an atmosphere where visions and strange sensations seemed completely natural. The result was a kind of collective intoxication. No one person was singled out for unusual behaviour because everyone shared the same state. People laughed louder, danced harder, and claimed to see things in the flames or hear voices in the night. Some described feeling touched by spirits or filled with new strength. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like a neighbourhood barbecue where the food was contaminated, the drinks were too strong, and the music never stopped until dawn, leaving everyone convinced they had experienced something magical. These communal highs reinforced beliefs in the sacred power of festivals. Villagers saw them as times when the boundary between the human and the divine grew thin. They believed the fire purified them, the music carried them closer to spirits, and the food and drink connected them with the cycle of the earth. What they did not realize was that chemistry and exhaustion were playing equal parts in shaping their experiences. Still, the meaning was real to them. The sense of energy that filled the village during these nights was remembered long afterward. People spoke of feeling renewed, of being closer to one another, of sharing something that could not be explained in ordinary terms. The social bond created by shared intoxication was stronger than any sermon or law. These events reminded the community that they belonged to each other and to the land that sustained them. I cannot help but think that if I were there, I too would have danced until morning, swept along by the same haze of smoke, drink, and music. Not all festivals ended peacefully. Sometimes the combination of altered states and crowded gatherings led to fights or accidents. A villager might stumble into the fire, or tempers might flare after too much drink. Yet these events did not stop the traditions. The benefits, in the eyes of the people, outweighed the risks. To them, festivals were essential moments of release in lives otherwise ruled by labour and hardship. The image of a village square filled with people swaying to music, drinking strong ale, and breathing smoke while flames lit the night sky shows how entire communities could be carried into altered states together. It was not recognised as intoxication. It was called a celebration. The villagers did not seek escape in the way a dying patient or a desperate healer did. Instead, they stumbled into it while honouring the cycles of nature. As these collective experiences became part of tradition, other groups began to experiment more deliberately, seeking not just celebration but hidden truths, crafting elixirs and strange brews that promised power far beyond ordinary life. In the medieval imagination, there was always a fascination with secret knowledge. Alchemists, men who claimed to hold the keys to transformation, stood at the edge of medicine, magic, and philosophy. They were not simple healers who worked with herbs in the open air. They worked in chambers filled with glass vessels, powders, and strange liquids. Their goal was not only to cure sickness, but to unlock deeper truths of existence. One of the ways they promised to do this was through elixirs. These were bottled mixtures of alcohol, resins, and plants that they claimed could lengthen life, bring wisdom, or open hidden doors of perception. Villagers and nobles alike were drawn to them because the promise of an elixir sounded like a shortcut to strength, health, or enlightenment. The recipes were rarely written down in clear terms. Alchemists valued secrecy. They described their mixtures in coded language, mixing spiritual symbols with practical instructions. A bottle might contain wine infused with frankincense, myrrh, and resin from exotic trees. Into this, they might add crushed seeds or roots that carried alkaloids capable of altering the mind. Sometimes, opium resin found its way into the blend, brought by traders from the East. Sometimes belladonna or henbane was included, their dangerous properties disguised by layers of other flavours. The result was unpredictable. One sip might calm the body and sharpen the mind. Another might cause dizziness, confusion, or violent visions. It is almost funny that people believed these bottles contained the secret of the universe when they often contained nothing more than badly mixed plant poisons. Elixirs were sold as gifts of wisdom. Alchemists claimed that their concoctions could purify the body and spirit, allowing drinkers to reach states of clarity unavailable in ordinary life. Some who drank reported moments of insight, where ideas seemed to flow freely and problems felt simple. They described hearing voices, seeing patterns, or understanding the world in new ways. To them, this was proof that the elixirs worked. To others, it was little more than the effect of intoxication. The blurred line between chemical reaction and spiritual revelation made the elixir a powerful tool for those who wanted to believe. The reputation of elixirs spread quickly. Nobles purchased them at high prices, convinced that they could unlock hidden potential. Merchants carried them across borders, selling them as rare treasures. Apothecaries stocked smaller versions, watered down but still strong enough to affect the body. People spoke of alchemists who had achieved visions, who had glimpsed the divine, or who had survived illnesses others could not. These stories added to the aura of mystery. Few asked how many others had lost their reason or their lives in the same pursuit. There were always dangers. Some who drank too much fell into deep sleep and never woke. Others lost their senses, wandering through streets muttering about things no one else could see. Families sometimes hid relatives who had been ruined by elixirs, ashamed to admit that the search for wisdom had left them broken. Yet the promise remained strong enough that people continued to buy. In times of uncertainty, the hope of finding answers in a bottle outweighed the fear of harm. If we compare it to today, it would be like someone buying an untested supplement online because it claimed to unlock genius. only to end up in the hospital instead. The alchemists themselves believed they were working with sacred forces. To them, alcohol was not just a drink, but a solvent that carried the essence of plants. Resins were the captured souls of trees, condensed into solid form. When combined, they thought these materials could connect the human body to higher planes of existence. Their laboratories were half workshop, half temple. Glass bottles glowed in firelight, powders were measured with careful hands, and the air was heavy with smoke from burning herbs. The atmosphere alone was enough to make a visitor feel as if they had stepped into a place of mystery. Those who drank often described the experience in glowing terms. A nobleman might say he felt his spirit rise above his body. A monk might write that the elixir opened the gates of heaven. A merchant might swear that he suddenly understood the secrets of trade and fortune. These accounts made the elixirs more popular, spreading their reputation far beyond the walls of the alchemist's chamber. The truth, however, was that each person was reacting not to divine truth, but to the chemical effects of the blend. The sense of clarity was temporary, and the price that followed was often exhaustion, confusion, or worse. Despite this, the belief in elixirs endured. Alchemists were respected, feared, and ridiculed all at once, but they were never ignored. They filled a role that no doctor or priest could. They offered access to something beyond the ordinary world, even if their mixtures harmed as often as they helped. The possibility of transformation was too alluring for people to turn away. I find it easy to imagine that if I lived then, I too might have sipped from one of those bottles, hoping for wisdom, and only later realizing that what I had found was a fog I could not escape. The image of an alchemist's workshop shows why the elixir captured so much imagination. A dim room lit by fire, shelves lined with glass, powders, and herbs scattered across wooden tables. In the centre, a bottle filled with dark liquid promised answers to anyone brave enough to drink. The atmosphere combined fear and hope in equal measure. Those who drank believed they were stepping closer to eternity. Those who watched wondered whether they were witnessing enlightenment or madness. As time went on, the stories of alchemists and their elixirs merged into folklore. Some were remembered as wise men who touched divine truth. Others were condemned as frauds or sorcerers who led people astray. In both cases, the elixir remained at the heart of the tale. It symbolized the human desire to escape the limits of ordinary life, to break through into something larger. Whether it brought joy, madness, or death, it always promised more than the everyday. In this pursuit, medieval people showed the same pattern seen in every other part of their lives with intoxicants. They turned to what was available, mixed it with belief, and accepted the risks for the chance of something greater. The elixir was never just a drink. It was a dream in liquid form, a fragile bridge between suffering and hope. From the dim workshops of alchemists, the use of smoke and resins did not remain locked away. It moved into churches and sanctuaries, where incense became a powerful part of worship, filling the air with scents that carried the faithful into states they thought were holy. For most medieval people, the church was the centre of life. It was not only the place for prayer and ritual, but also the stage where every important event was marked, from birth to death. The experience of entering a medieval church was overwhelming. High stone walls echoed with chants, stained glass filtered the light into deep colours, and thick clouds of incense rolled through the air. To the faithful, this smoke was a symbol of prayer rising to heaven. To those inside for hours at a time, it was more than a symbol. It was a substance that entered the lungs, settled into the body, and changed the way they felt. The incense most often used was made from frankincense and myrrh. These resins burned slowly over hot coals, released a rich, heavy aroma that filled every corner of the church. At first, the scent was calming, but as the hours passed, it grew dense. People breathing it in were not simply smelling a pleasant fragrance. They were inhaling compounds that had subtle effects on the nervous system. The result was a sensation of lightness, a dulling of sharp thought, and sometimes even mild euphoria. It is almost amusing that what was believed to be the presence of God may have been nothing more than the chemistry of tree sap. The architecture of the church made this effect stronger. Stone walls trapped the smoke, allowing it to build with each passing service. In smaller chapels with little ventilation, the air grew thick enough to sting the eyes and coat the throat. Worshippers sat or knelt in the haze, listening to chants repeated endlessly by monks or priests. The combination of rhythmic sound and heavy air created an atmosphere that could easily tip the body into a trance. People described feeling as though time slowed, as though their thoughts drifted beyond themselves. Many believed they had entered a holy state of vision. The ritual use of incense was deliberate. Church leaders valued it for its symbolism, but they also saw the effect it had on worshippers. A congregation subdued by smoke and sound was more receptive to the message of the sermon. People left the building not only convinced of spiritual truths, but also deeply moved by what felt like a direct encounter with the divine. The mixture of faith and biology was powerful. To question it was unthinkable. Accounts from the period show how often visions were reported in such churches. Ordinary men and women claimed to see angels, to feel the hand of God, or to hear voices that told them what to do. Pilgrims wrote of collapsing in tears or laughter, convinced that they had touched heaven. The intensity of these reports makes sense when one considers the physical conditions. After hours without food, surrounded by chants, candles, and smoke, the body naturally slid into a state of altered perception. If we compare it to today, it would be like sealing hundreds of people in a room filled with aromatic smoke, and then being surprised when some claimed to see things that were not really there. The priests themselves were not immune. Those who handled incense regularly breathed in far more than ordinary worshippers. Their long hours in smoky spaces left them light-headed and sometimes unsteady. Some chroniclers note that priests collapsed during services or spoke with unusual intensity, as though carried by a force beyond themselves. These incidents were often explained as divine inspiration, but the physical explanation is equally strong. Despite the risks, incense was never abandoned. It became so central to worship that services without it were considered incomplete. The scent itself became linked with holiness, so much so that even today it is still used in many traditions. Medieval people could not separate the aroma from the sense of the sacred. For them, to smell frankincense was to be in the presence of God. The possibility that it was altering their perception never occurred to them. The psychological effects were strengthened by expectation. People entered the church already believing that they were about to encounter the divine. When the smoke blurred their senses, they accepted it as confirmation. The faint dizziness, the warmth in the chest, and the dreamlike focus all became proof of the presence of God. Communities treasured these experiences and encouraged one another to seek them. The cycle fed itself, generation after generation, until the association between incense and vision was unbreakable. Even the design of rituals encouraged altered states. The repetition of prayers, the low drone of chants, the swaying of processions, and the flickering of candles all work together with the incense. This kind of sensory saturation can easily push the human mind into a trance. To people with little understanding of biology, the explanation was obvious. They were witnessing miracles. I cannot help but think that if I lived in those times, I too would have left a smoky chapel convinced I had glimpsed heaven. For ordinary villagers, these moments were some of the only breaks from the harshness of daily life, a service that lifted them into visions, whether real or imagined, was a treasure. It allowed them to believe they were part of something larger, that their suffering had meaning. The combination of incense, ritual, and exhaustion gave them hope. It may not have been the voice of God, but it was powerful enough to shape lives. The image of a crowded medieval church, filled with smoke so thick it hung in beams of candlelight, shows clearly how people could slip into altered states without realizing it. They were not seeking intoxication, they were seeking God. Yet the result was the same as in so many other places: a body overwhelmed by the environment, a mind carried beyond its usual boundaries. From the smoke of sanctuaries to the secretive rites of heretical groups, the blending of intoxication with religion did not stop inside the church. It spilled into strange gatherings where faith, sexuality, and potions combined, creating experiences that frightened authorities and fascinated those who heard the rumours. Beyond the walls of the church and the order of monasteries, there were always groups that rejected official authority. These were the heretical sects, small gatherings of people who believed they had found a truer path to the divine. Many of them met in secret, often at night, away from the watchful eyes of priests and nobles. In these hidden meetings, rituals took place that mixed elements of worship, sexuality, and intoxicating substances. To outsiders, these gatherings were monstrous. To participants, they were liberating. They believed that in breaking boundaries, they could reach truths that ordinary life denied them. The key to many of these rituals was a potion that they called a holy drink. Recipes varied, but most contained strong alcohol blended with herbs that carried stimulating or hallucinogenic properties. Mandrake, belladonna, or henbane might be included. Sometimes opium resin appeared, sometimes crushed seeds with strange effects. When taken in groups, under candlelight and chanting, the drink produced feelings of warmth, euphoria, and disconnection from the ordinary world. Participants believed they were filled with divine energy. It is almost darkly humorous that what some called the spirit of God was likely just the rush of alkaloids flooding their nervous systems. The drink was only part of the ritual. Once intoxication began, the sects often broke social and moral rules that defined ordinary life. Some stripped away clothing as a sign of rejecting worldly shame. Others engaged in sexual acts, believing that passion itself could be a form of worship. The substances they consumed lowered inhibitions, making it easier to cross lines they might never have dared in the daylight. They thought they were stepping into sacred freedom. In reality, they were simply carried by chemistry and suggestion. The authorities found these rituals both shocking and dangerous. Rumours spread quickly that heretics held orgies in the woods or performed obscene rites in abandoned barns. Whether the stories were exaggerated or not, they contained kernels of truth, stimulating substances, darkness, and the rejection of rules did produce behaviour that looked wild to outsiders. The church labelled these sects as blasphemous and demonic. Trials were held, punishments were severe, and many were executed for their gatherings. Still, the practices never fully disappeared. The human hunger for both transcendence and release was too strong to erase. The writings that survive about these rituals show how powerful the experiences were for those inside them. People claim to have visions of angels and demons, to feel themselves lifted out of their bodies, to hear voices that guided them. The blending of intoxication and sexual release made the sensations even more intense. In a society where ordinary people lived under constant rules and strict controls, these nights felt like freedom. They returned to their daily lives convinced they had touched something divine. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like people gathering for a rave with hallucinogens, only to call the whole thing a holy service. Not every participant sought pleasure. For many, the purpose was spiritual. They believed that the body had to be broken down to release the soul. By stripping away clothing, drinking the holy potion, and giving themselves over to frenzied acts, they thought they were crossing into a higher state of being. The altered states created by drugs reinforced this belief. They mistook their visions for revelations and their impulses for divine commands. For women especially, these rituals offered something different from ordinary life. In the broader society, women were expected to obey, to remain silent, and to stay under the control of husbands or fathers. In the sects, intoxication and ritual gave them space to act without those limits. They could speak, move, and desire freely. The authorities saw this as proof of corruption. The women themselves may have seen it as the only moments when they could feel alive outside the chains of custom. I cannot help but think that if I lived in such restrictions, the chance to drink, to forget rules, and to feel part of something greater would have been irresistible. The repression of these sects was harsh. Armies of church and state hunted them down. Entire groups were destroyed in raids, and survivors were paraded through towns as warnings. Chroniclers wrote with horror about what they claimed to have found. But even in the anger of their words, there is a sense of fascination. The idea that ordinary villagers could abandon their identities, fueled by smoke and potions, terrified and intrigued those in power. It revealed how fragile social control could be when confronted with intoxication and passion. Despite the violence of repression, the stories lingered. Generations repeated tales of heretics who met under the moon, who drank potions, who cast off shame, and who claimed to see visions. In many cases, the memory of these rituals became more exaggerated over time, feeding into the later image of witches' sabbaths and secret gatherings. What began as sectarian rites became part of a larger folklore of forbidden intoxication. The image is vivid: a circle of men and women gathered at night, drinking a bitter potion from shared cups, smoke rising from burning herbs, music and chanting echoing, bodies swaying until the boundaries of self and society dissolved. To participants, it was liberation. To outsiders, it was sin. Both perspectives show the same truth, that substances and ritual together had the power to reshape human behavior. In these secret rites, we see one of the clearest examples of how drugs, sexuality, and belief could fuse into something explosive in medieval life. It was not about recreation, it was about breaking free, if only for a night, from the narrow world of rules and fear. That freedom carried a terrible cost, but the desire for it never disappeared. From the hidden sects that met in darkness, the story of intoxication moved outward again, into the lives of wanderers and outcasts, people who lived beyond law and order, and who carried their habits into the roads and alleys of medieval towns. In every medieval society, some did not belong anywhere. They were the wanderers, the drifters, and the nameless figures who moved from village to village with no fixed home. Some were beggars, some were deserters from armies, and some were outcasts driven away for crimes or misfortune. Among them was a group that came to be feared more than most, the ones who were constantly under the influence of intoxicating plants and drinks. These people lived on the edge of survival, scavenging whatever they could find, and using whatever substance might numb their hunger or pain. Over time, they became symbols of disorder, unpredictable and dangerous, both pitied and hated. The substances they used were crude. Unlike nobles with access to expensive potions or monks with carefully measured incense, wanderers relied on what they could gather or steal. Any liquid that had fermented, whether fruit juice left too long in the sun or scraps of grain soaked in water, became their drink. Mouldy bread, spoiled ale, or dregs of wine from taverns served the same purpose. When no alcohol was available, they chewed roots and leaves of plants that carried toxic qualities. Henbane, thornapple, or even pieces of mandrake root might be gnawed in desperation. The effects were unpredictable. Some staggered through villages laughing and shouting. Others collapsed in ditches, twitching and foaming. It is almost bitterly funny that people with nothing had to settle for the most dangerous highs. While the wealthy sipped their opium wine in safety, villagers feared these figures. They appeared suddenly, with wild eyes and slurred speech, sometimes half naked, sometimes carrying strange charms or sticks they claimed had power. Children were told to stay away, and adults locked their doors at night when wanderers were near. Tales spread of robberies, assaults, or fires started by men too intoxicated to know what they were doing. The presence of such people reminded communities of the thin line between order and chaos. In villages already struggling to survive, one unpredictable stranger could cause weeks of fear. Yet fear was not the only reaction. In some cases, Wanderers under the influence were believed to carry messages from beyond. Their mutterings, their strange visions, and their sudden outburst were seen by some as prophetic. A woman who raved about fire might be remembered when a barn later burned down. A man who shouted about famine might be quoted when the crops failed. Villagers, uncertain how to explain these coincidences, sometimes saw in the intoxicated ramblings a glimpse of fate. What to one person was madness, to another looked like a divine warning. If we compare it to today, it would be like treating the incoherent words of a homeless addict as breaking news about the future. This uneasy balance of fear and belief gave the wanderers a strange place in society. They were shunned, but they were also sometimes listened to. A village might chase them away one day and then whisper about their words the next. Local priests condemned them as agents of the devil, but peasants who lived close to the land often wondered if they carried truths hidden from ordinary eyes. The combination of intoxication and outsider status made them mysterious, even when they were simply suffering from the poisons they consumed. The lives of these people were short and harsh. Without steady food or shelter, their bodies weakened quickly. Constant use of toxic plants damaged their minds and organs. Many died young, alone on the roadside or buried without a name. But their image lived longer than their bodies. Chronicles mention them as warnings, and folklore preserved their presence as half-mad prophets or cursed souls. They became figures that stood for everything unsettled in medieval life: poverty, danger, and the lure of strange visions. The law rarely showed mercy. Wanderers caught in towns could be beaten, branded, or expelled. If accused of theft or violence, they might be hanged without much question. Those clearly under the influence of strange plants were sometimes brought before church courts, accused of witchcraft or possession. The line between madness, intoxication, and sin was never clearly drawn. For authorities, it was easier to punish than to understand. Despite this, the image of the intoxicated wanderer fascinated people. In songs and stories, they appeared as figures of chaos, stumbling through villages with wild laughter or shouting predictions no one wanted to hear. Children learned to fear them, but also to remember their words. The contrast between their ragged appearance and their mysterious visions made them unforgettable. In a world that valued order and faith, they embodied disorder and doubt. It is striking to see how different social classes experienced intoxication. The noble lady sipping a measured potion in her chamber was praised for her refinement. The monk breathing smoke in a chapel was honoured for his visions. The peasant healer using herbs was both respected and feared. But the wanderer, with no home and no standing, was condemned as dangerous. I cannot help but think that the only real difference was that the poor had no choice but to consume what others threw away, and society judged them for the results. These figures did not fit neatly into categories. They were neither holy visionaries nor deliberate seekers of pleasure. They were people crushed by hunger, cold, and despair, numbing themselves with whatever they could find. Their altered states were not chosen for enlightenment or celebration. They were desperate escapes from reality, brief flights away from misery. In that sense, they reveal another side of how medieval people got high, one shaped not by curiosity or ritual but by survival at its lowest edge. The picture of a ragged man staggering through a village, his eyes red, his words jumbled, and his body weak, while children hide behind their mothers and elders mutter prayers, shows clearly how intoxicants created fear when linked to poverty. It was not only the substances themselves that mattered, but also who used them. For the rich, intoxication was elegance or piety. For the outcast, it was a mark of shame. The legacy of these wanderers lingered long after they were gone. Folklore turned them into characters who foretold disasters, warned of plagues, or carried curses. Villages remembered them not only for the trouble they caused, but also for the strange fascination they inspired. In the end, they stood as reminders of the fragile line between suffering and vision, between madness and prophecy. From the roads where wanderers staggered, the story of intoxication did not stop. It continued into the very cradles of medieval households, where even infants were not spared the touch of substances that promised peace at a terrible price. In the medieval household, constant noise was a fact of life. Families were large, rooms were crowded, and work left little time for rest. Among the most exhausting challenges was the cry of infants. Babies were rarely left alone. They slept near the fire, beside their mothers, or in cradles pulled close to beds. Their cries echoed through small timber houses, keeping entire families awake at night. Mothers, already burdened with endless labour, sought ways to bring silence. One of the answers they turned to was a soothing drink, a mixture drawn from roots and herbs that dulled a baby's senses. These concoctions became the first intoxicants many children ever received. The ingredients were known to women who cared for households. Roots such as mandrake or henbane were sometimes steeped in water, creating a bitter liquid with sedative qualities. Drops of this were placed on a baby's tongue or mixed with milk. The effect was swift. The child stopped crying, grew drowsy, and sank into long sleep. For mothers who had to grind grain, fetch water, or tend animals, this was a relief too great to question. The cost of using such drinks was hidden, and many never realized the danger. It is almost grimly funny that a society so afraid of demons did not hesitate to give poison to its children in the name of peace. Other methods were common. Some women rubbed ointments containing sedative herbs on their breasts or on cloths used to nurse babies. The infants, sucking or chewing, absorbed the compounds without knowing. In some households, a piece of cloth dipped in the mixture was tied near the cradle, allowing fumes to calm the baby through the night. These practices were shared quietly among women, passed down as household wisdom. They were not written in medical texts, but they were repeated in kitchens and by firesides until they became part of ordinary care. The result was that infants experienced altered states from the very start of their lives. Their small bodies, fragile and easily overwhelmed, were drawn into long spells of heavy sleep that were not natural. Breathing slowed, eyes fluttered, and limbs grew limp. Mothers welcomed the silence. Fathers, who needed rest for labour, thanked God for a night without disturbance. What none of them understood was that the baby's body was being forced into submission by chemicals far too strong. Some survived and grew accustomed to it. Others did not wake, their deaths recorded as mysteries of nature. The trade in soothing syrups and powders grew steadily. Apothecaries sold mixtures designed specifically for infants. These were advertised as safe, carrying gentle names that suggested comfort. In reality, many were made with the same dangerous plants used in adult sedatives. The bottles were small and cheap, making them accessible to families of every class. A noble household might keep them beside perfumes and medicines, while a peasant mother might scrape coins together to buy a vial from the market. Both believed they were protecting their children. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like finding bottles of morphine syrup marketed for babies on the shelves of a pharmacy. The cultural acceptance of these methods is striking. Instead of seeing them as harmful, people praised them as responsible parenting. A quiet child was considered a healthy child. A family that managed to sleep through the night was thought fortunate. Neighbours sometimes traded advice on how much to use, comparing amounts as if they were recipes for bread. In this way, dangerous substances were normalised in the most intimate parts of life. The practice was not only about convenience, it was also tied to fear. Many parents believed that constant crying was a sign of evil spirits or curses. When a soothing drink silenced the child, they saw it as proof that the spirit had been driven away. The connection between sedatives and protection became deeply rooted in belief. Mothers did not feel guilty for using them. They felt relieved that they had defended their children from unseen dangers. The consequences, however, were long-lasting. Children who survived regular doses grew up in bodies shaped by early exposure. Some may have developed tolerances, needing stronger amounts to feel the same effect later. Others grew weak or sickly, their systems strained before they had even walked. These outcomes were rarely connected to the soothing syrups. Parents blamed fate, curses, or poor luck, never guessing that the bottles on their shelves were responsible. I cannot help but think that if I were a parent in those times, exhausted and desperate, I might have done the same, without realizing the cost. The social dimension of the practice is also important. Families that managed to keep their babies quiet were seen as orderly and blessed. Those whose infants cried through the night were pitied or judged. The use of sedatives became not only a tool of survival, but also a marker of respectability. Mothers who resisted using them were sometimes pressured by others who could not understand why they endured constant crying. In this way, the practice spread further, reinforced by community expectations. Medical authorities of the time rarely condemned the habit. Physicians occasionally warned about overdosing, but they did not have the tools to measure or regulate. Most simply accepted that small amounts of sedatives were part of childcare. The church, too, paid little attention.